Welcome. How are things going, man?
Yeah, Nathan, I much appreciate it. Things are going well. I feel like as a gym owner, everyone, is finally feeling out of the woods a little bit and the weather's getting nicer. So yeah, not much to complain about over here.
Nice, man. So I always like to just get a little history for the listeners, people that are listening, just to get you kind of them up to speed on you. Maybe give a quick rundown on how you started in fitness, how you got into gym ownership, and kind of your story.
Yeah, I'll try to make this quick. So I was an athlete all the way through high school. Had some bad experiences with coaches in the later parts of my high school, sports career, and really turned down some scholarship offers for basketball to just go to college and be a normal kid, and I think that it was obvious really early on that the drive to be an athlete was still there. And I got into jujitsu and Muay Thai, and then that led me into CrossFit. And that kind of blended really well with my exercise science background through school. And for me, it became really obvious really early that I just wanted to own a gym. At 22, I started Hardbat Athletics, and that was about 10 and a half years ago now. And just been, running with it ever since. So we have the privilege of working with general population, and we obviously, implement level method and CrossFit methodology. And then I'm lucky enough to get to work with a lot of teenage athletes, all the way to nationals level weightlifters and power lifters, and CrossFit athletes and such. So yeah, it's I've had quite the array of experience over the last decade and some.
Yeah, and you got started pretty early. You look at success, like the whole 10 years, the 1,000 hour or 10,000 hours and all this sort of stuff. And it takes a long time to kind of get up to being, what people consider success. So I look at your gym. You've been with us for a long time within Level Method, and you run a really tight ship. Like, your business processes, everything is dialed. And I think, like, what was the learning process for you? Like, how many years did it take? So starting at 22, when did things start to kind of click into gear for you? Or did you have mentorship early on? Like, how did that work?
Yeah. So, this is a funny topic because I feel like one of the biggest disservices you can do to a young entrepreneur is try to convince them that you had it all figured out and you knew exactly where you were going and how you were going to get there. Like, the reality is, unless you have someone that is directly above you leading, and paving the way the entire time, like, you really do got to kind of figure things out as you go. And unfortunately, that means that you're probably going to make a lot of unnecessary mistakes. In hindsight, I really wish that we had pursued mentorship earlier on. I think that what you're really paying for with mentorship, be that, a coach or a business coach or what have you, is you're paying for time. You're going to someone that already has done the things that you want to do and has proven that they can do them well, and they're going to teach you how to do them. So I would say that, we definitely waited longer than I would have liked to find mentorship, and part of that was my own personal ego I had to get around. Part of it was, was monetary. But once we did jump on board with Two Brain, that was a massive overhaul. And then the thing that I think for us was something that was always a staple and has helped us tremendously is just that we've always kept a really tight-knit team, and been really good about keeping coaches around for the long haul and picking the right people for the right jobs. And that has just been tremendous. And to be quite honest, like, our membership base, like most gyms, has people that just come from a vast amount of backgrounds that have been, just over the moon helpful over the last decade.
Yeah, that's I think that I was the same way. Like, I didn't want to spend the money early on. I thought that I could figure things out on my own. I could read books. You can read books and you can really accelerate, but there's something to be said about being able to ask somebody specific questions that are unique to you about a certain circumstance, and have someone that has a lot of experience give you essentially the answer. Now, it's not going to be exactly like, you're going to have to still do some thinking, but there's something to be said about that. I think Two Brain has done a great job within the gym space of just kind of mapping out a pathway for people. And when we were in Maryland, we went to dinner, and one of the things that we talked a lot about was your onboarding process. I was really impressed with just how you have put things, you've layered multiple things into your onboarding process. You talked about the company that is kind of that's near you, like physically located close to you, and how you work with them, and how you've kind of put in a screening process and all that. So I think the onboarding process for a lot of gyms is a struggle, right? Because you got to have systems in place. You got to have the right people in place. You have to have them doing the systems appropriately, so you're not doing everything. So maybe tell us a little bit about just how you've morphed and changed and evolved your onboarding process, and sort of the big things that are important for you in that whole.
Yeah, absolutely. So, I mean, we went through, a multitude of phases where we had our 2-class intro. We tried group intros. We tried individual intros. We tried manipulating the amount of intros. We manipulated the types of information we would give them, the types of movements we would go over. When we moved buildings, like we really made a large transformation with a lot of the things that we did, both to benefit the member and the coach and the gym. And the structure of our onboarding process now is one where we really try to layer in, making sure that there's fun involved for the member, right? So we're not going to deter them with just too many screenings and too much technical work. But at the same time, we need to gather as much information and inventory as we can on the member, so that we now have kind of an objective baseline for them and can build off of that. And it gives us, it's easier for retention purposes as well, because it makes programming for that person easier as they get into the classes, and we can let the members know the different limitations and restrictions and little idiosyncrasies that each member has. So what we do is we incorporate an FMS screening. There's a few SFMA, pieces to that as well. And really, so we start with a table screening. And table screening is obviously something that's a bit more passive, but it allows us to see basic range of motion within the hips and the shoulders, and how that might affect, joints below that. And then, we take those correlates, we give them like a rating of like a 1 through 4, based on, where they fall in terms of their mobility restrictions. And then they hop off the table. We put them through basic FMS, checking things like rotary stability and such. Really, it's just to gauge how they move in space, what their muscle tension and flexibility looks like at a passive range and also at an active range. And then that gives the coach a lot of ammo to work with as they now get into their intros, and they're like, okay, we're going to take you through, all your levels and take you through all the movements. And now I already know, like, your hinge pattern is probably not going to allow you to pick up a barbell from the floor because, you're missing 30 degrees of hip flexion, so these correlates are just instrumental in setting the coaches up to not wasting time as part of the intros too. There's just certain things you don't even need to attempt with people based on the restrictions that you found as part of their screening. So we use a template for the intros very similar to what Level Method uses or promoted when we first hopped on with you guys. And we basically try to run them through all their levels. We do not try to maximize their potential early on. Obviously, there's the caveat or the exception of, the athlete coming into the gym that has a lot of history and previous experience with different, physical demands and exercise. So, we do isolate, certain people in that regard, and there are exceptions, but for the most part, yeah, it's like most people that come through the door are yellow, orange, and at most we'll get some people blue. But yeah, it's just trying to create a baseline. And again, like, instilling that happiness and like the positive association to exercise. The last thing I want is like, yeah, like you PR'd your mile, but now you hate this place because you vomited and you're really sore.
Right.
Yeah. So it's a good balance, right? It's like, we tell the coaches all the time, like, get as much information as you can, but make sure they're having a blast.
Yeah, it's funny because safety is obviously a huge part of fitness. It's a continuous thing. I was just talking to a gym owner who doesn't do the level method because they don't do inversion, and they don't, which it was totally cool, and they don't use any barbells. And I like when I hear something like that, it's from a safety oriented position, but at the same time, when you screen people appropriately, but there's nothing wrong with barbells. Like you kind of need it if you want to get stronger. You need some sort of, the barbell is very good to be able to load and continue to grow. So when you're looking at that safety aspect, people come in and some people aren't going to be using a barbell in certain ways, right? So, and you move them up to different chunks and kind of segregate them off. Now, do you do PT? How does personal training play a role? So when you have somebody like that who can't do stuff, they can't pull from the ground, do you slot them into PT, or how does that process work when you have
so we do this as part of the consultation process, and then it's a continued part of the intros, where we have a tiered offering up front that's designed to be a prescriptive model. It's like, we're going to tell you what you need. And look, this is a privilege, I believe, to some degree, is something that we can do it because we've been in business for 10 and a half years, right? And have a solid base. I get why people are deterred from doing it early on, because when people need more work, it costs more money, So we do use a tiered offering, and we are very honest with people. Like, if I genuinely believe the best thing for you is to do 12 personal training sessions before you get into classes, then that's what I'm going to recommend that you do. If I think that you should exclusively do PT until you are, basically signed off by the coach and they want you to go into group, or think that you can do some sort of a hybrid model where you're doing PT and group, then that's what you're going to do. And it is like surprising just like how receptive people are. Like, people want to be told what to do. Like, that's why they're coming to your gym. So basically the way it works is, currently we run a 6-week model. And we have it as people at minimum have to do 5 PT sessions, and then they get into classes after that. So roughly 2 weeks of PT only, and then 4 weeks of group. And then there is an 8-week or an 8 PT option where they do 5 intros, and then they have 3 of what we would call fine-tune sessions, where they can do them as part of being in classes. And this way, if there's anything that comes up, hey, cleans bother my elbow, or dead hanging is still hard for me, whatever the case, the coach can work on those things specifically. And then there's just an extension to that where they can do 7 additional sessions, so 12 in total. And that has proven to be very effective for us.
Yeah, I imagine you personally aren't doing all of this stuff. And I know this for a fact because you have quite a balanced life. Like, you go on vacation, you take time off. This is very important for long term, right? Now, yeah, the question that I hear all the time, or the concern, or the people just think that they have to do everything. How do you get your coaches? How do you train them so that they know what to do and how to do these sessions? And what's your process? What's the coach training process look like for you to be able to have a team of people that are able to onboard people at, members at this high standard?
Yeah, I mean, I think one integral part to that is I just have an absolute rock star of a GM. So I cannot emphasize that enough. Like, having the right person as kind of, in this case, your right-hand woman is so tremendously helpful. But also just the longevity of our coaches. Like, most of our coaches kind of came up in the old school way, in the sense that they were members with us first, so they got to experience going through intros with myself or with my GM or another coach at Hardbat. And they've been part of the culture and understand like our priorities as a gym. So that helps tremendously. But as far as like the actual coaching development side goes, like once we get them onboarded, we love to actually start people with coaching intros before anything else, because it allows you to be in a one-on-one setting, right? It allows you to deal with an array of different limitations and restrictions. And we tell the coaches all the time, like, be honest. Like, if you don't know an answer to something, like if they have a question, come to us. And if we don't know, we're going to outsource and go to people that we trust, you know? So we try not to, put them in a position where they have to come up with an answer to anything. And, as far as like taking them through the paces, it's like you would typically see. They shadow us as part of an intro. We'll sit them down afterwards and go, hey, like, this person is missing knee flexion and is experiencing pain, here, and is dealing with symptoms X, Y, and Z. Here's how we're going to prescribe exercise to this individual moving forward as part of their intros, right? And then, it gives them an opportunity to kind of ask questions along the way. And then from there, they do intros and we shadow them. And then we eventually send them off on their own. But look, I tell them all the time as part of our meetings, like there's people that come in that have limitations that I'm stumped on, and I have to go to my physical therapy friends, to ask questions. So
what is your meeting? How often are you doing meetings? This is another thing. When you look at creating teams, what are your meetings like? How often do they happen? How are they structured?
So I would say we have a GM who's obviously full-time, and then we have a full focus coach. So he's not full-time, but like he could put in full-time hours if I needed him to. And then we have an additional 4 other part-timers, and we're in the process of onboarding 1 or even potentially 2 others at the moment. So it differs in terms of like, so I meet with my GM twice a week. We meet for an hour twice a week. And then my GM, myself, and my full focus coach, we try to meet, I would say like once a month for about an hour. And the intent behind those meetings can change a lot. And then the whole team, we try to get together at minimum once every 2 months. I'd really like to do it once every 6 weeks. It's just hard, as your team grows, like trying to get everyone together is never easy.
Is that part-time thing, where if people like getting everybody's schedules to line up can be so difficult. Now, what advice do you have for people looking to find for gym owners looking to find good people? So you had mentioned your GM, you have these good coaches, you have people that you're onboarding. Are they coming from inside the membership base? I mean, that's kind of how it is.
I would say mostly, yeah. And it's funny because I think to myself often, like, okay, like when are you going to hire someone that hasn't been part of your gym for a long time? It makes the process so much smoother. And look, maybe this is just my lack of skills as as an interviewer, but it makes the process so much easier to hire from within, because they already meshed with the culture. You've seen them and gone through personality conflicts and just dealt with conflict resolution, and you've seen them in terms of their behavior on other members and such. So yeah, it's just really, it's helpful to have people come from the membership base. But as far as picking the right team, I think that it starts with being really honest about your own personal shortcomings. Because what you don't want to do is hire yourself, and you have to be careful with like the vanity metrics. Like I feel like you can fall in love with like, oh, this person knows marketing. It's like, okay, but is that all they're going to do for you? Like what other things can they do? So one thing that I think is congruent in our space is that you have to be good at multiple things. Like in other words, like you're better off thinking laterally than extremely deep most of the time when you're talking about working inside of a micro gym. So like you're far better off like knowing a good amount about Olympic lifting and knowing a good amount about gymnastics, and that falls in for like the head coach, right? Like being able to spread yourself out and conceptually apply things laterally has massive benefits. But it's the same is true for the business side. Like I don't have a business degree, but it helps tremendously for me to read books on business, but to have a really good in-depth understanding of like how those concepts can be applied within the fitness industry, but also understand what the coaches need to be done and also understand what the members want. Like it helps to kind of have this versatility, as far as your knowledge base goes. So when hiring, I think that's what I look for, right? I look for, are they personable? Can they think laterally, across multiple dimensions? I mean, I don't know. Do they play well with others?
Right. I mean, it's a huge part of coaching. Like you've got to be personable. You've got to be able to work with people and be able to feel like have empathy and kind of know what they're going through. This is sometimes with younger coaches, athlete kind of coaches that are trying to put their values on people all the time. This kind of happens. But one thing that I want to bring awareness to here is that the idea that you had said earlier that people come through and they kind of have the example of you and the gym, and they kind of come up through the ranks of they engage with the gym, and then they start to learn these things and they see how things run for a year or a couple of years or whatever. And they're being vetted essentially through that whole process. And then once they do kind of go into the inner workings and they see behind the scenes, it's continued to be validated along the path where they're like, okay, I can see this works. It's not some fake thing. This is something, because you get that it can be a very fake world, fitness, and maybe not necessarily in the functional fitness, but just in general. You see how people talk about people in the back room or whatever about all the members. But I think that, finding really good people that's the crux. You need team and systems, right? Team and systems are the two big things. And once you have your systems in place, it's really all about, for a gym owner who wants to have freedom of time and to be able to do things, you need to get these people in place. And it's got to be one of the highest priorities. Now with your GM, was your GM from inside?
She was, yeah. So ironically, she was in school. I believe she was pursuing like to be a veterinarian or something of that sort. And then just kind of like completely flipped the script, decided she wanted to go exercise science. And she basically came to me as a college student and was like, I want to do what you do. Like, how do I do it? So I was like, let's get coffee. And then, she came on part-time, and then her role increased. And then when the slot opened up for her to be the GM, she had earned the role. So.
And, one thing about that, it's like I use the word finding good people, but maybe the better word is to attract good people. So sure. It's like by having the right, by being an example for people, you attract good people to you, and you build a team over time. So anything that you want to add on onboarding in general, any sort of tips or tricks or anything that you've seen that might be helpful for somebody? The onboarding process, we do the 5 kickstarts, but you have sort of this FMS pre-screening that's very important. But anything that you see that kind of bugs you, maybe that you see when other people are doing their onboarding process or something like that?
Yeah, I mean, I think that we address the one, which is just be prescriptive, like tell people what they need, give people what they need. Like that's really it. I mean, I blame, or I think of this because I blame myself a lot in the early years of, looking at someone and being like, oh, like you really need a lot of personal attention, being like, okay, group, like two sessions and you're in, because we just wanted to we were afraid of making the offer, or afraid of trying to make the sale on the PT. So we would put them in a position where they weren't going to succeed, So I think that's a big one for me, because it's a huge deterrent for new people to go into a system that they're not prepared for. So that would be the main one.
And what are the biggest price point that you have? This is another thing with sales within gyms. They're like, oh, what's the big package, the most expensive package that you have?
So our price points range from $675 upwards of, I believe it's like $1,200 for the highest price point and for your first 6 weeks as part of the program. But the thing is for every person we lose, we save another person as well, because this has also helped tremendously with our retention, because people now value the PT, right? They want to do more of it. And they value the expertise of the coaches, and they get into class feeling like they know what the heck they're doing, and they know their place, and Level Method helps out tremendously with that, because they can go, oh, okay, like I have all my levels. I know that I'm not going to get hurt, but I also know that the things I'm doing are helping me get better.
Yeah. When people pay, they value. This is just a classic, right? Like if you give everybody has experience doing free things. Oh, let's do a free program or a free challenge or whatever. And the compliance is always super low. But then when you charge people or you go into these higher price points and people pay it, then they're like, their psychology is, oh, well, I paid it, must be valuable, even though obviously It is going to be, if you're doing it right, it's going to be valuable. It's going to be worth it. It's going to be a value exchange, right?
Absolutely.
So, okay. So moving on to the one of the things that we've kind of talked about quite often, but the intensity piece.
Yeah,
so let's talk about just how you think about intensity within fitness and some of the flaws and maybe some of the cultural things that have developed over time.
Yeah. So I thought about this, and I think about this quite often, because it's been like a pain point for me as a coach and as an owner for quite some time now, both as part of my growth as a coach and as an owner, right? Like my own personal recognition and my shortcomings and failures, to prescribe the right amount of intensity and volume and for our members. So I had this kind of hypothesis that I've generated, and I was going to bounce this off of you. So I got into CrossFit in it was like 2009, maybe late 2008, early 2009, right? So the games was just becoming a thing. And at that point, it wasn't far-fetched, and maybe this is just my gym, but I believe this is true across the board. It wasn't far-fetched when you would go to the gym to see, your average, Joe or Jane, working out 4 or 5 days a week, and they happen to have somewhat of an athletic background, and they could make it to the next level, right? Like they could surpass the open and get to the next level, and then maybe even past that. And like they had like they had kids and a life and a full-time job. And I think that what this did was it created this, it bridged the gap between being like a general member and the possibility of going to the next level, right? So I feel like it was far more common back in the day to see people training, right, to advance. And not that there was anything wrong with that. But what started to happen then is the games really blew up, right? And then the gaps started to separate, but people still looked at the games as like the be all of what they wanted to be able to look like and move like and perform like. And what is the games, right? Like Castro, when he was still on board, had said like the games is not a WOD, it's a test. And so what you were seeing are these couplets and triplets and these really high intense, difficult workouts and this like huge amount of volume in some of the workouts that gym owners now had this dilemma where the members had this affinity for these types of workouts, right? So if you looked at main site and it's like 3x5 back squat, and it's like, guess what? That's all we're doing today. Or we're practicing back scales and front scales, and we're going to work on dead hangs and handstand holds. These things aren't as sexy as the 21-15-9, chest to bar pull-ups, with a run or whatever the case, right? Like, so I think part of this was framed early on, as the games gained its popularity and the members fell in love with this idea of like, doing, open style workouts and giving every workout everything you have and like the laying on the floor type of mentality. And I think that it just created a bit of an addiction to the suffering that's associated with really high intense workouts. And again, they have a place. Like I absolutely believe that, the CrossFit methodology on main site often gets it right in that like there are workouts that look like that, but then the next day could be a 50-minute swim, right? And the day after that is practicing, some higher skill gymnastics work. And it's just like the balance on main site is often not what I see reflected inside of gyms. I see gym owners leaning into the like, well, the members love these triplets, so let's just throw them at them.
Yeah, I think this is really important. If you look at fundamentally the old school CrossFit mentality was mechanics, consistency, intensity, right? This is like foundational from way back in the day. And this, as you start to get the sexiness of like people trying to attain higher levels, you lose out on that and you stop seeing people moving well, and you start seeing people moving under drastic fatigue, high levels of fatigue, moving like crap, trying to go for a certain time or a certain number or something like that. They're striving for this thing, which in the long run kills the longevity, right? You kill longevity of somebody's journey. And like, I can speak from experience. I started CrossFit, or like got into it in 2007 when I was deployed. Then in 2008, when I got out of the Army, I immediately went into this world of like, I went to regionals, I think in 2010, but I had no business trying to be going up to these high levels, but the sport was new and it all seemed so possible. And then as you mentioned, as the years went on, that gap got bigger and bigger. You had so many more people doing it with different backgrounds and, people coming from professional sports and sort of changing. You also have the people that started when they're 16 or 15 but they start with the mechanics and the consistency through like the virtuosity of the original CrossFit idea. And then this gets watered down. And then you have the owners that are literally being driven by the perception of their members of the workouts and the training, right? And so in my gym, I had a client leave and go to a competition gym down the road from me because he wanted to do all this stuff. This guy he was in his 40s. He had no business at all trying to go to this competition gym, but he saw with stars in his eyes this idea of like, I'm going to be this badass and all this stuff. And like 3 weeks after he went there, he tore his pec doing muscle ups, trying to do muscle ups where they're screaming at him to do a muscle up, and he's coming up and he just tears his pec. And it's like, this is a surefire way to essentially stop the progress and then create a person who has a certain idea of what now CrossFit is. And like level method is really it's trying to be the antidote or the solution to not force, we're not trying to force anybody, but just kind of like bring people down a little bit so that they're doing things that are appropriate based on actual numbers.
I genuinely think that it takes a better coach and a better, system of owners and management to convince members to do the things they actually should be doing. Right. Like, I think that the easy route is to just throw intensity at people and be like, yeah, have fun. And then hopefully our churn rate doesn't get too crazy and we can, fill these gaps of people that are getting injured. Like the reality.
That's trust, right? It's like that requires trust. So
it requires trust. Yeah. And it's like, you have to have a really good explanation for why you're having them do things like functional bodybuilding, right? Isolation work, tempo training, or very specific, intensity based, running or rowing intervals where it's like, yeah, these are kind of monotonous and boring, but guess what? Like, they're going to help you tremendously. And there's intent behind them, and I think that's really what this leans into is it's like, your programming and the facilitation of everything you do in your gym has to have purpose behind it. And, not for nothing, like there's gyms out there that literally have multiple coaches programming on a whim. It's like, oh, it's Jen's turn. It's Tuesday. And it's like, that's not how this should work.
And it becomes like a competition of who can create the hardest, craziest workouts.
Right. Yeah, no, precisely. One thing I was talking about with my GM the other day was that it's so I have nothing against intensity, and coming from a background of weightlifting, like that sport is basically all intensity, right? Like in terms of what you're optimizing for, at least. And I think for me that drew out kind of a point, which is that it's the capacity for intensity that is important, not the frequency of it. So if you look at the most intense athletes in the world, right? If you were to isolate like 100-meter sprinter, I think people fail to recognize how little that person runs near their absolute best 100, right? Like in terms of their training protocols, and the same is true for CrossFit athletes. Like I think people would be really surprised to know how little CrossFit, right, style workouts, right, the high intensity couplets and triplets, those guys and girls are doing all through the majority of their training year, right? Like most of that macro cycle is, looking like fixing weaknesses and developing motor control and, ensuring proper range of motion.
Base so that it can support this like huge output, right?
Yeah.
Like,
I mean, the old Louis Simmons thing of like a pyramid is only as tall as its base. And I think that, and that's the thing is like, there's a lot of CrossFit gyms that have taken kind of the tip of the pyramid and just made it exclusively their programming. Look, I've dealt with it too. Like we've had people be like, this workout's not hard enough. And I'm like, this workout's not supposed to be hard today. Like that's not the intent behind this one.
And what's interesting about that word hard. So there's a couple points. Hard, it depends on how you look at hard. Like, is it that you're dying? You're so tired that you're dying and that's hard. But another thing is, Poliquin, the strength coach, great of the world of strength coach, of coaching, he differentiated between intensity and density. Right. So one of the big things that he always talked about was that it's like the kind of training that a lot of classic CrossFit workouts, while we call it high intensity, it's actually much more in line with high density. So it's things are kind of compressed into a time frame where you're trying to get as much work, while intensity, like with weightlifting, intensity is like a percentage of effort, or if you're doing a sprint, this 100% is like high and very, very high intensity. You can't necessarily do true high intensity over 20 minutes, but you can definitely increase the density. And so people, if you're lacking foundational functional movement, proper movement, and you increase the density, so you're doing a lot of crappy movement, this is not good, right? This is
that's a fascinating point. Yeah, well, and I think this leads to the conversation of, if you're doing intensity every day, are you actually doing intensity? Because if you're not moving the needle, right, which the intent of intensity is to move your absolute, whether it be your strength or your aerobic power, you're trying to move the needle in an absolute sense. And by doing those things every single day, right, you are operating lower and lower in, relative to your absolute max. Your body just cannot facilitate that on a daily basis unless you're taking a ridiculous amount of exogenous supplementation.
Exactly. Yeah, exactly. That brings up the point. I don't remember the exact quote, but Charlie Francis, the sprint coach, he said, if you can't come in your next workout and increase by at least 1%, then like the previous training wasn't productive. Now you have to take that with a grain of salt and kind of consider the world that he's coming to. But I mean, it's a good point, because if you're not able to give more the next time, so if you're going all the time at what you are perceiving as high intensity, it's just a matter of time until you burn out. It's the same thing with like a linear progression of strength for an advanced athlete. So if you take an advanced strength athlete, if you take like a Louis Simmons, somebody who's doing conjugate, they're super high level, and you say, okay, you're going to do a 5x5 every week, and you're going to increase by 5 pounds every time. What ends up happening is you just completely fry the nervous system. So like you cannot do that. Now a beginner can do that because the nervous system isn't the thing that's adapting, right? There's like a neural pathways. There's a whole bunch of things that are happening that aren't like actual nervous system changes. And I think that that's being able to, just based off of what you said, just like being able to improve or increase each time, like you need rest. You need to be able to take that downtime.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that what the product of this becomes is that injury and, inflammation and just, problems are a lagging measure of that acute to chronic ratio, right, within your training, right? So, when you're doing, like, if you're doing a bunch of really high intense workouts for a couple weeks, you can actually usually get away with it. Like, the injuries rarely arise during that training. It's 3 weeks later when you're like, oh, like my hip flexor's been bothering me, or like, oh, my erectors won't calm down and are spasming, and like I keep getting this clicking when I'm going overhead now. So, and I think that plays its hand in this sometimes too, because people aren't immediately aware of the implications of this, high frequency to high intensity, and I think that sometimes it takes weeks before these things become exacerbated, and then they just don't know why. They can't connect the dots, and so it takes a good coach to be able to say, no, like, I'm not going to allow you to get there in the first place. And like, one of the mantras we use, and I tell our coaches all the time, is that 80% of the time the member should leave feeling like they could have done more. And then there are days, like, trust me, on the days where we're going high intense, I tell them, like, I want you sub 3 minutes on this. And I always get the eye rolls, and I'm like, I'm not kidding. Like, we've trained for this. It's, we've taken the steps necessary to put you here. We trust you to be in this position to give, 110% today. But on the days where we're doing work and I'm like, I want you at an RPE of 8 today, number one, it's like they first have to appreciate the fact that it's going to make them better to go at RPE 8 and not RPE 10. And second off, they have to have a relative gauge of what that even feels like. And I think this is a piece that goes missing when all you care about is trying to go as hard as you can, is you don't understand how to pace, right? And this is why, if you take most CrossFitters that only operate in like let's say a 4-minute to a 15-minute time domain, and you say, hey, we're going to do a 40-minute EMOM today, they die. And it's because they're so used to this sprint rest mentality that the sustainability is not there. They don't understand how to spread their exertion out over 40 minutes.
Yeah, and you look at like adaptation over time. This is, again, where trust comes in, with the client being able to trust that you kind of know what you're talking about. I think every coach has had the client that thinks they know more. They think they know better. This is the problem. This is like the young entrepreneur who thinks they know better. They're like, oh, no. And what ends up happening is they learn the hard way. This is what happened to me. Like, I'm doing stuff that I was doing that I shouldn't have been doing, grinding doubles, trying to do all this stuff every day because more is better. This is what you think. This is kind of what, like, you're inoculated with this thinking of like, well, if I train twice as hard, I'm going to get better. But it's the same thing as working twice as hard. So, okay, if I could work 12 hours a day, then I'm going to get twice as much done. But, well, that's only if you're able to focus and you're able to maintain, but nobody can do that. So if you can,
and there's fallacies baked into all this, like if it's not to the detriment of the member, sometimes for my own entertainment, I will allow people to do the thing that they think is right, that I know is going to make them sink the boat. Like, we'll have some people that are like, I'm putting my damper at 10. And I'm like, all right, have fun. Like, your workout just changed more than but go ahead, have at it. It's like, I know they're not going to throw their back out in the pursuit. They're just going to, be completely, anaerobically busted by the halfway point. So yeah, I mean, we do appease people sometimes. And I think that there is wiggle room. I think it's important for people to find their own limitations sometimes, as long as there's not, the consequence on the back end of it.
Yeah, for sure. So, something, this is kind of now taking a turn. Well, actually, before we move off topic, one thing that I do want to say is that I think intensity is very important. Like you need the doses, right? And I think we agree on that. Like I like, it's really like character building to be able to just push, get on the air bike and do something where it's just, you're not going to hurt yourself, but you push to this point. And it's a training mechanism, and it can help people really become stronger individuals mentally, emotionally, in so many ways. But then there's obviously a tipping point where it becomes, okay, now it's too much, and it's not going to be beneficial. And we need to be able to embrace these other forms of training. And when we look at like level method as an example, we have these energy systems, a model of doing energy systems. We have different kinds of workouts. They're all scaled appropriately, so someone's doing it, and that's just controlling them. And when the time comes up to be able to do, they're allowed now to unleash. They can totally unleash and then get all of the benefits that come with intensity.
Yeah, absolutely.
Intensity works until it doesn't.
Yeah, no, for sure. And I actually use the lingo of, limiting factor a lot with the members. Like I will say, your limiting factor today should be, X, whether it be ventilation or blood flow, or, muscle stamina, you name it. It's like giving them, an idea of how they should feel in the workout. Both it helps with scaling, and obviously level method automates a lot of that. But it tells them a bit about pacing, right? And like the intentions of the workout. So they're not in a workout that's supposed to be, muscle endurance based, trying to breathe as heavy as they can,
Right. Yeah. And it's hard to relate these concepts. This is the curse of humanity is we all start with no knowledge, right? And we come up and we learn things, and then we learn, and then we're trying to tell people that are coming up like, hey, trust me, I've gone through that. And it's like, you can't really, they just kind of have to go through it in some cases, in most cases. But you can create sort of theories and structures of thinking to help people understand things faster, so that they can accelerate through the phases. Because I think there's no skipping phases. You can't skip, but you can go through it faster and kind of become aware of these things faster. I think understanding energy systems, understanding the variation of energy systems and how workouts feel different. And when we think about like a classic, what we think intense workout, which would be like a lactic tolerance, lactic endurance, depending on where you're coming from, this just completely painful, full body pain, that's a certain energy system. It's just like when you do the workout right, when you do the system, in order to access that system, you have to kind of go to this place, and where you're doused in just complete pain. Now, it doesn't mean that that's going to be the most effective form of training forevermore. It just means that that's one system, and you want to dose that system every once in a while, but you also want to understand, like you had said, how to pace and how to do these other systems, because each one is going to elicit a different response. And by understanding these things and having members start to grasp these concepts, they're like, oh, so not every workout feels exactly the same. This is when I first started CrossFit. Every workout was just a complete pain cave. My lips would go blue. I'd be like just lost. A 20-minute workout, 5 minutes in the 20-minute workout, I'd be like done, and this is
and like, look, we mentioned that even for the highest level athletes, like they're not doing workouts like that every day, maybe with the exception of their peak, before like a major event or the games or such. We also underappreciate just how much effort goes into the stuff that goes on outside of the gym for these higher level athletes that is just impossible to be present for 99% of the public, right? It's like we have to take into account that like we've got parents that are sleeping 4 hours sometimes a night because the kids are waking them up, or, work is really crazy and their cortisol levels are high because they're an accountant and it's tax season, and so it's like when you're taking all these things into account, it's like you're not doing your members any benefit by just continuing to ramp up those cortisol levels by, jamming high intensity down their throats every day.
More stress.
So yeah, I mean, it matters for the context of, the general public.
And speaking of balance, this is actually like kind of wrapping it up, because what I want to talk to you about for a gym owner who's listening is this life balance. Because something that I admire about you because we were going to do something. We had a webinar but you were going on vacation. And so you were setting up your stuff so that you wouldn't have to be on the webinar right before. Remember that? So there was like, and it's like, you're setting these boundaries and you have balance in your life. So tell me just like how that has evolved for you over time. Because I'm sure you've gone through as an entrepreneur, every entrepreneur goes through the phase of working, grinding, like thinking that that's the answer. Intensity is the answer. So tell me a little bit about that.
Yeah, it's funny because like if someone were to like look at my life now compared to even like 4 years ago, I would objectively look so much lazier. But doing far better in so many dimensions or domains. I mean, I think, yeah, part of this is that you do have to front load your entrepreneurship with just a lot of hard work, right? So I think it's easy to fall in love with the grind in some sense. And then there's a level of control there, like you believe you can do everything the best. So you want to do everything. And I like for the first 6 or 7 years of owning the gym, I worked from 6 a.m. Seeing clients all the way until 7 or 8 p.m., sometimes even later, depending on when we would close shop. And it just, I didn't take any vacations outside of some like local beach trips. I wasn't making enough money to do a lot of the things that I wanted, let alone buy a house, and at some point, I think you just recognize that like, this is, like when you're just getting started, you think this is the life, man. Like I'm doing what I want, and I think you start to recognize that there's so much more that you want to explore and be able to do. And for me, like, I'm just such a curious person. Like I love learning. And that requires time, so freedom of money is great. And I think that every entrepreneur should seek that, but freedom of time is more precious. And if you can attain that, like that's the center of the bullseye, man.
Time is life. That's what we're living in. If you have more time to be able to do the things that you want to be able to do, I mean, working is great, but a lot of times there's so much self-worth built up in, if I'm not working, I'm worthless.
Yeah, well, and I started to realize that the most selfless thing I could do for my business was to give people things to do, delegate tasks, right? Lean into people's strengths and trust them and invest in them, time, energy, and money. And the business has grown as a product of that, and it's been amazing. Like now, I have the dream of having multiple full-time employees and like being able to support them and their families, and being able to grow a facility that can facilitate, multiple people making a living and a bunch of part-timers loving what they do outside of their normal work. So yeah, I mean, I think that door has only opened as I've become more comfortable with handing things off.
Yeah, it's hard. That's, I think, the hardest thing. I think that's a great place to wrap it up and close it down, man. I want to thank you for just spending time and sharing your wisdom, and this is a great discussion. So
yeah, absolutely. Let's do it again.